decisions. Decisions of all shapes and sizes and importance. This morning, we all got decided what time to get up. We decided what to wear. We decided whether or not to take a shower, which I did, by the way. We decided what to eat or what not to eat, what vehicle to take to come here. All kinds of small decisions, unimportant decisions. Life also has its share of pivotal decisions, life-altering decisions. What kind of vocation will we choose? Who will we marry? Where will we live? Will we have children? How many children will we have? Those are the kinds of decisions that really change our lives. Many of those decisions will require a great deal of sacrifice. Those are the big decisions. But there is not a decision any larger than the one that we will talk about this morning that we are challenged with in Joshua chapter 24. Joshua chapter 24, Joshua, who has been the spiritual and military leader of the people, poses this challenge to the people: choose this day who you will serve. There is no bigger, greater, more important decision than that one. Who will we serve this day? Choose you this day who you will serve. And I want to look at the background of the full context of that challenge that Joshua presents to the people. And to do that, I think the most effective way to do that is to kind of just go back and look at a historical timeline, because that's what Joshua does. In a sense, we're kind of looking at the whole chapter of Joshua chapter 24 this morning. And before Joshua even begins to pose this challenge, he goes back in history many hundreds of years and reminds the people of the faithfulness of God, as someone has yelled out this morning. And so you're going to have to forgive my artwork as we go through this. But I figured rather than read it, let's actually go through a picture version of the timeline that Joshua gives us here. And I'm just going to grab my Bible and help me out here. Can you see this okay? Is this large enough? Everybody see it all right? Back in Joshua chapter 24, beginning in verse 1, Joshua starts a historical, kind of a walk through history to remind the people of the faithfulness of God. He starts back in Genesis chapter 12. This is the call of Abraham. In Genesis 12, I'm going to kind of go through this quickly. This is long, and you're not going to get out on time today. I'm just going to tell you that right up front. I've got so much on my heart, and I just feel like, in fact, I was thinking this morning, if there's a message that I think is pivotal to every single one of our lives, it's this message from Joshua 24:15. Not because I'm speaking it, not because of anything I have to say, but this is the most important question you and I will ever have to continually make. And so, I will not make apologizes for going a little bit long this morning. Genesis chapter 12, God calls Abraham. Abraham was childless, he was old, his wife was old, and God says, Abraham, I'm going to make of you a great nation. You're going to have descendants greater than the numbers of sand on the seashore. You won't be able to count them. And I'm going to give you a land. And he gives him all this. And in Genesis 12, he basically says to Abraham, get up and go. And the next verse says, Abraham picked up his stuff and he went. And so that's the beginning of kind of the outworking of God's plan to restore humanity to himself that was lost in the Garden of Eden. So that's Genesis 12. Well, we begin to see this played out in a simplified, kind of smaller form. Abraham actually has a son, Isaac. Isaac has Jacob and Esau. And God gives them a land. They have a place, and it's a place where they can live, and it's fertile. And you've heard the story of Lot and Abraham and the different pieces of property that they had. Well, then ultimately, and we're just kind of jumping ahead quite a bit, one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, is he's sold into slavery by his brothers. And just we see, I wish we had time to talk about this on a grander scale, because the sovereign hand of God is so incredible as we look at all of these stories. But by the hand of God, Joseph is brought to second in command in all of the land of Egypt. Second only to Pharaoh. As a result of that, he is able to bring his family from their land, which was famine-ridden, or would have been, which it was going to be, into Egypt, and to preserve not only his family, but the very line of the Messiah. And so that was Egypt. They were in Egypt in slavery for 400 years. Ultimately, the family got so large, Pharaoh said, you know what, they're going to outnumber us, and they're going to fight us, and so let's enslave them. And so they were enslaved for some time there. And so then God raises up this man, Moses. And I know that this is a stretch to say, but this is actually Moses in a basket in the river, the Nile River, okay? And so this is incredible too, because Pharaoh, he's a little worried, very worried about Abraham's family outnumbering him. She has all the babies 2 years and younger killed. Well, as God would have it, the very one child that Pharaoh had to be worried about was the one that God preserved. It was Moses. And so God raises up Moses. He's actually hidden in these bulrushes by his mom. She didn't, of course, no mom wanted her son's life to be taken. She hides him, and as only God could do it, Pharaoh's daughter finds him, says, Dad, can I keep him? Dad says, okay, but we need somebody to raise him. And so again, as only God could do it, by the hand of God, Moses' mother is actually chosen to raise him. And nobody knows it's Moses' mother. And so it's just incredible. Moses grows up to be a man. He's now royalty, and he leads the people out of the slavery that they experienced in Egypt. He did that, God did that through the use of 10 different incredible, miraculous plagues. The ultimate plague, of course, was the 10th one, where God said, you're going to kill a lamb, put the blood on the doorpost of your house, and tonight the death angel's coming through town, and if there's no blood on the doorpost of your house, your firstborn is going to be killed. Well, the Bible says that all of Egypt was mourning the next day, because, of course, the Egyptians didn't do that. God's people did, and his family was there. They were preserved. And so the 10th plague, of course, was typology. It's symbolic. It was real, but symbolic of ultimately that Messiah, that Lamb of God, who would die, whose blood would preserve and save you and us, you and I. And so they were saved from slavery through those 10 plagues. Ultimately, really, the 10th plague, they come to the Red Sea. And you know the story. Can't pass it. There's a multitude of people and a sea that's absolutely impassable, and God miraculously brings them through the waters of the Red Sea. Well, right as they're about to do that, Pharaoh comes up behind them, and they think, okay, well, he's let us go, but now he's going to enslave us again, and God does a miracle, and as Pharaoh and his army try to go through that Red Sea, God's people are saved, and Pharaoh's army is completely destroyed. And so this is actually God's people cheering over here. And by the way, if you ever want to look it up, I believe it's the History Channel or National Geographic, actually has a special right now of an expedition that occurred in the Red Sea, in which they have discovered golden chariots in the bottom of the Red Sea. And of course, we as believers know that that's because of that event. No one would ride a golden chariot but the Pharaoh. And they actually have cameras and pictures of those pieces in the bottom of the Red Sea. And not surprisingly, it is right at the location of a monument that King Solomon had built to memorialize that day. And so we know that that is actually that's there because God did that. Well, so then they started a 40-year wandering through the wilderness, and people know all this story. You know, Joshua doesn't go into all these details, but the people know the details, that during that 40-year wandering, God gave them food, God gave them clothing, God protected them, He guided them by a pillar of fire by night, a cloud by day, and He protected them. And so then Joshua goes, and toward the end of that wandering, he tells them about their encounter with the Amorites. And God tells them, I protected you from the Amorites, this formidable army that came your way, and brought you then, there's another river crossing that Joshua doesn't mention, but at least not in any detail. They get to the Jordan River, God does another miraculous crossing of that river, and the people go through, they go into Jericho, and again, we wish all the details we had time to talk about, because that city of Jericho was taken, but not by the people's might, not by the people's power, but by God. God says, you're going to march around that city for 6 days, one time a day, and then on the 7th day, you're going to march around it 7 times, and then you're going to blow your trumpets, and you're going to yell, and the city's going to be destroyed. And that's exactly what happened. This powerful city of Jericho before and after was just a pile of rubble. Well, then he tells them about their encounter with all, I just call them the ites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and all this. This is actually a hornet. I know it looks a little bit more like a colorful bat. he describes that, it's a picture. He says, I sent the hornet before you to destroy all of these ites, all of these different people groups. And so God fought their battles and ultimately brought them into the promised land that he promised Abraham way back here that he would do. And he says this will be a land that has gardens that you did not plant, that has cities that you did not build, and you will enjoy the benefits of somebody else's hard work. And that's exactly what they experienced. Exactly what God said to Abraham was what happened hundreds of years later. And Joshua reminds the people of that. And after that, turn your Bibles to Joshua chapter 24. Because it's after all of that reminder, after all of that history lesson, that certainly would have been passed down to these people. They would have been very familiar with the details that aren't in Joshua 24, but the ones that I've shared with you, as well as others that their moms and dads and their grandparents had shared with them. And in verse 14, after all of that, Joshua says these words, now therefore. The therefore is a reference to everything that he's just said. Because of everything that God has done, now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Three things there. Fear the Lord. Have this, not just this reverential awe of him, we've got to have that, but it's really a fear. It's a fear that says, God, you are God. And you are in control, and you will have your way. And just like a shepherd will break the leg of a sheep whose tends to stray, God, you will, figuratively speak, you'll break my leg in order to bring me back into a place of safety because you love me. And so it's a very real fear and reverence and awe of his might and his power. But then he says, serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. The word is two words, sincerity. Serve him for real. This is not with some ulterior motives. This is not with some phoniness that I better do this or else God's going to do this, but it's a real sincerity of heart. And with faithfulness, the word is consistency. It is with, how many of you know how easy it is to be up and down, and I'm on this mountaintop, and then I'm in this valley, and I'm faithful to God, and then I'm not. And faithfulness, we talk about God being faithful, we don't even grasp the concept as humans. We're just fickle. And he's calling them to a life of faithful service to God. Consistent, not this up and down kind of fickleness. And he says, put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river in Egypt and serve the Lord. If it's evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve. That's our text for today. Whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so Joshua gives them a choice. In fact, what I want to look at this morning is that text, choose this day whom you will serve. I want to point out four things. Actually, I want to point out a lot more than four, but four general things. The first is this. He tells them, first of all, to choose. And when he tells them to choose, the implication there is that there's more than one choice, right? We have choices. And that implies to us that there's more than one thing that we can choose. And in fact, as Joshua gives them this challenge, he actually reminds them that they have four choices. And he goes back, in fact, these two verses here, if you read with me, he says, now therefore fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and faithfulness, put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river. Choice number one is, in summary, it's the gods of your parents. He reminds them, way back here, this is what he's talking about, beyond the river. He's talking about in the region of Mesopotamia. That's where Abraham lived. This was a godless people group. Abraham followed God, but he was not the norm. And so he says, are you going to serve the gods? When he says, will you serve the gods that your fathers served beyond the river, he's referring to that time. The gods of Mesopotamia. And they knew the history of that. They knew that in Mesopotamia there was a plethora of gods. There was a God for every occasion, a God for every season, a God for every walk of life. They just had gods like you wouldn't believe. And so what Abraham, or what Joshua is calling the people to is, are you going to follow those gods? The gods that your ancestors followed? Will you have a God for every season? Will you have a God for every day? Will you worship the sun? Will you worship the moon? Will you worship all of these things? And in short, he's saying, will you worship the gods of your parents? Will you worship the things that your parents worshipped? And this is a challenge for every one of us. if we are not careful, in fact, I would suggest to you that every single one of us in this room, without exception, brings into our childhood, we bring into our adulthood, we bring into our relationships, into our workplace, into every arena of our lives, you and I bring some degree of the gods, the counterfeit gods that our parents worshipped. We bring into our lives. It's just part of being exposed to the various relationships that we lived with, that we grew up with, and every one of us brings into the arenas of our lives. This came up on Facebook. I thought it was kind of funny, but very appropriate. Nobody warned me that my child could possibly develop an attitude similar to mine. We pass on what we worship, the way we live, what we value, our attitudes, our heart. We pass that right on. We pass that on to our children. This one also came up. I thought it was better. Your children will become what you are, so be what you want them to be. And that's what Joshua was saying to these people, because here's what Joshua had observed. Joshua, for a number of years now, had been the leader of these people. And he had seen the cycles. He had seen he had known the history for hundreds of years, and in his lifetime, he's almost 110 now, he had seen how it all works together. These people followed the gods of their parents, who followed the gods of their parents, who followed the gods of their parents, and then ultimately they all pass it down to their children, who then pass it down to their children. And Joshua says, is that the cycle you want to continue? Is that what you want to do, people? Do you want God right now to be the cycle breaker, or do you want your kids to worship what you worship? The empty, dead-end, meaningless stuff that you worship. We all bring much of this with us. In fact, Heidelman in his book, Gods at War, makes this statement. We are constantly erecting idols in our homes and teaching our children who or what is worthy of our worship. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, we are constantly erecting idols in our homes and teaching our children about who or what is worthy of our worship. Our parents did it, their parents did it, and we are doing it. And Joshua says, now is the time to break the cycle. Will you worship the gods of your parents? Now, I don't want to begin to try to convey the list. It is endless of what our parents might pass down to us. But I do want to kind of put a practical skin on this and just give you a couple of examples. And I'll stereotype here a little bit. But let's suppose that you're dad and your work is your life. Your career is your life. Your happiness, your attitude is determined by how well your career is going. If you had a good day, the family knows it because you come home and you're in a good mood. If you had a bad day, your family knows it because your attitude is determined by that, and you come home and you're in a bad mood. Your career is your life, and you're willing to make sacrifices for that career, sacrifices that God's Word would say, you know what, those things ought not to be sacrificed for that career because they take precedence over that career. If that's you, you could be a man or a woman, but the fact of the matter is that's a counterfeit God. And if you have that counterfeit God, it's very possible, in fact very likely, that probably one of your parents had that counterfeit God. And it's also very likely that you will pass that counterfeit God on to your children. Again, maybe you're a woman, and I suppose a man is just as prone to this, and maybe your image matters a whole lot to you. And your happiness isn't determined by your vocation, but your happiness is determined by how well people think of you. And you just care so much about, do they think, are they impressed by me? Do they think I'm pretty? Do they think I'm handsome? Do they think that my clothes are in style? You've got somebody coming over and you want to make the house just perfect. And it's not to honor the person, it's because you want them to walk away at the end of that dinner meeting and just think, wow, they're incredible. You want them to be impressed. And your attitude in life is determined by how people think of you. Well, that too is a counterfeit God. And if you have that counterfeit God, which every one of us in this room is so very prone to, then your dad or your mom probably had it. And you will pass that on to your children as well. And Joshua just wants to stop the cycle. People, will that be the God that you serve? That's choice Number one that he gives them, the gods of their parents. He goes on and says, "What away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt." And so, parents again, but it's two different places. The gods of your parents in Mesopotamia, the gods of your parents in Egypt, and I'm going to call this the gods of the past. Because for a while, right here in Egypt, in slavery alone, the people of God were in Egypt. And in Egypt was very much like Mesopotamia in that they just had gods beyond what you could number. A God for everything that you could possibly imagine. But here was the difference, and here was the struggle that happened with the people of God in Egypt. They were in there for 400 years, in slavery for 400 years. And when you were around people, when God's people came into Egypt, they were monotheists. The people of God were. We believed in one God. But in Egypt, they were polytheists. And what happened was during that time, that polytheism began to rub off onto these monotheists. And before you know it, the people of God were doing the same thing and worshiping the same things that those who didn't know God were worshiping. But here's how it differed from Abraham's day. You know that in Egypt, you've seen the pictures, that they had this kind of weird way of combining, they had these animals and these creatures, kind of like the Greeks did, a man body and a beast head. And all kinds of crazy kind of combinations. I call them kind of their hybrid gods. We just want to cover all our bases. So we'll worship man, we'll worship the god of the falcon as well. We'll put them all together and we'll have this hybrid god. And this mix and match kind of thing. Well, in a very real sense, that's what happened with the people of God. They came into Egypt. Well, we're not going to abandon our God. We worship the one God, the creator of the universe. But boy, that God does kind of look exciting, and we're told that this one here does some pretty powerful things. And so, rather than abandon our God, what we'll do is we'll just put together this mismatch of hybrid religious experience, and we'll have our God, and we'll have the gods of the Egyptians as well. And sure enough, surely we'll then cover all of our bases. And so they had this ultimately, this picture of God that was just a conglomeration that didn't even begin to resemble the one true God of the Bible. And so when Joshua says, will you worship the gods of your past? That's what he's asking them. Will you worship the one true God, or will you have this mix and match? And people, we struggle with that today. I mean, we don't worship falcons and crocodiles and the sun and the moon. But you know, how easy is it for us to sometimes open up the Word of God and say, well, I don't like that part of God. I don't like that thing that He calls me to, or that thing that He calls me away from. And that's kind of offensive. And so, but boy, I love that part of God. I really like that. And so before you know it, we're doing the same thing that the people of God did in Egypt. We've got this mix and match kind of God that's not the God of the Bible. Will not deliver, will not fulfill or satisfy or do anything that the God of the Bible will do, and we will be let down, and who gets the credit for that? God. And we look at God and say, God, you didn't deliver. You weren't the God that your word said that you were, and God would look at us and say, wait a minute, you weren't even believing in me. You didn't put your trust in me, you put your trust in me in a bunch of mix and match gods that you picked at your will, at your volition. Joshua says, is that what you're going to do? In Ezekiel 20, God through Ezekiel says to the people, get rid of the detestable idols that you look for help. Don't dishonor yourselves with the disgusting idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. This was a struggle with the people of God. It's a struggle with us as well. The third God, the third choice. These are all counterfeit little g gods that we're looking at initially here. I'm not implying in any way that there actually is another real God out there. They're all counterfeits. They're all phonies except for the real one. But then he says, put away the gods your fathers served beyond the river in Egypt and serve the Lord. And then in verse number 15, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you now dwell. These are the gods of the present. These are the gods of people where the people of God lived right then. We could call them the gods of the present day culture. How many of you know how easy it is to be swayed, to be influenced, to be impacted by the culture that surrounds us? I would suggest that this is the most damaging, dangerous, easy one to be swayed by, because it's all around us, it's the norm, it's generally accepted as what is acceptable, and before you know it, we become prone and very involved with the worship of the things that the world around us worships. It's called, Kyle Eidelman in his book calls it the law of exposure. What we are around, what we become. What we are exposed to, we become. And so God's people are presently in the land of the Amorites, and they have their gods. And Joshua says, are you going to let that culture, Romans 12:2, the paraphrase says, squeeze you into its mold? I hope you know that the devil and the world around us want nothing more than for us to be squeezed into the mold of the world. To be squeezed into the way they do things, to worship the things that they worship, to put our hope in the things that they worship. And the devil wants that more than anything because he knows that if we do that, we will ruin our lives because it is a dead end and it is empty and it is meaningless. And the devil knows at the other end of that, we will blame God for a failure to provide and to deliver. And it's not God's fault at all. It is our fault. It's the law of exposure. We live in a culture that desperately wants to squeeze us into its mold. Again, we could go on and on with the list of what the gods are of our culture today. Of course, at the top of that list, our culture today worships sex. We have a very godless value system. There's secular humanism that is worshipped. Worldly thinking, moral relativism, psychology, psychiatry, money, stuff. All of these things are the counterfeit gods of our culture. They are the things that the world has chosen to replace God in hopes that those things might bring answers and hope that only God was ever intended to bring. And it's not working. And it won't work for them, and it won't work for us. And Joshua says, are you going to choose that? Will you choose the meaningless, empty gods of your culture? That's choice number 3, the gods of the present. The last God is the one true God. It's 4 choices. Gods of your parents, gods of the past, gods of the present, or the one true God. He says this in verse number 15. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That is a powerful verse. It's a powerful verse in a number of ways because, number one, Joshua is one of those men that, very few of these in the Bible, who started well, but who also finished well. We don't see this guy Joshua, even David, who was a man after God's own heart. We see a lot of failures in his life. Joshua was one who said, who could say, serve God faithfully because he actually did it. And Joshua, we see in here the uncompromising, unflinching character of Joshua, who basically says, in essence, people, in a sense, it doesn't matter to me what your choice is. It's not going to influence my choice. You guys choose what you're going to choose, but as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. It's just hands down. It's a no-brainer for us. That's the decision we've made. I'm not waiting for your answer. That's the decision I've made. And dads and men in this room, this verse excites me because it reminds us, this calls for all of us, but this reminds us as men of the importance and the significance that by God's design we have in our homes and in our families to lead our families in the ways of God. Because Joshua says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You see, here's the way it works. Just as I can pass on some counterfeit gods to my children, I also can pass on the right God to my children. And this wasn't some power play by Joshua. As for me and my house, I've got my thumb on them, and they're going to follow. This was Joshua saying, I'm going to live for God faithfully. And I'm going to live for God uncompromisingly. And I can confidently say that my house is going to follow. And guys, that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about our ministry. If we want to see, I pray that your desire is that the church in America would just turn the world upside down for Jesus Christ. I hope that is your heart's desire. Well, in order for the church, in order for the world to be turned upside down for Christ, the church needs to be turned upside down for Christ. And in order for the church to be turned upside down for Christ, the men need to be turned upside down for Jesus Christ. Of people turning their hearts toward God, and we will be able to say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So those are the 4 choices. And if you've read Joshua chapter 24, you know how that story kind of ends. The people choose who? They choose God. It was absolutely for them, it was a no-brainer. Listen to their response. He says, the people answered, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." And they begin to replay the history lesson that Joshua has just given them. And they basically say to him, "Joshua, what choice really is there? None of these other counterfeit gods that we have chosen to follow at times and our fathers have chosen to follow, they've never delivered." In fact, Isaiah 64 says this, 64:4, "From of old no one has heard or perceived by the ear, no eye has seen a God besides you who acts for those who wait for him." There really is no other God. There's counterfeit gods, there's fake little g gods, but there is no other God, and the people recognize that, and they choose, we choose God. And I pray and I hope this morning that that is your heart's desire, that you have chosen God, and as you look at that list, that you also recognize that it is an absolute no-brainer. There really is no other choice. But let's look at the next word. Choose you this day. Second word is this day. And I'll kind of go through these quickly. But the next, choose this day. This is an implication. The first one, choose, implies that there are more than one choice. The second word, couple words here, this day, implies that the choice must be made continually. How many of you have ever made a bold commitment to Jesus Christ and then gone back? Gone back. Okay. One honest person who raises her hand. Kara. Okay, a couple more. We've all done that. How many of you know how easy it is to one day just say, "God, I will never, I just see you do an incredible thing, I will never turn it back." And boy, it seems like the next day, we're just back where we were. That's why Joshua says, choose this day. Because in a sense, this is kind of a two-part. On the one hand, there has got to come a time in every single person's life where we choose Christ. Where we come to the realization that I am a sinner, that I need Jesus Christ, that I am on my way to eternity in hell, and apart from Jesus Christ and an acceptance of His invitation of new life, that's where I will spend eternity. That's the choice we make at one point in our lives. I believe that decision is eternal. But there's a second choice we have to make every single day. And the decision of today, God, who will I serve? Because you know what, God, I see some gods of my parents creeping up. I see some gods of the past creeping up. I see some gods of the present that are just trying to take a hold of me. And so today, God, I need to choose you. And so that's why Joshua says that. Choose this day. I know, because see, Joshua knew these people. And he had known that so-and-so, I saw him the day that he got down on his knees and he made this commitment to God. But boy, he's just blowing it. And so he's calling these people back to a revival. Today, and every day will you make that choice. That's number 2. Number 3, choose this day whom you will serve. The implication here, of course, is that the decision is personal. Sometimes I'm surprised that we need to point this out, but I have opportunity all the time to share Christ with people. And I will say to them something like, do you know that if you were to die today, that you would spend an eternity with Jesus Christ? And you know the first thing that they say to me? Well, you know, my parents went to church. You know what? I grew up in a church or a home where everybody around me prayed and read their Bible. And, of course, my response is, it's not going to do you any good at all. Because the choice to follow Christ is a personal choice. It's a decision that you make. There are a lot of things that are hereditary. I might have my dad's chin, or which I'm not crazy about, by the way. I get called Big Chin an awful lot. But my mom's eyes, whatever you might, that wasn't in my notes. That was just for humor. But a lot of things that can get passed down. But knowing Christ is the one. That is a decision that you and I have to make personally. And there's no amount of faithfulness in your wife, or in your husband, or in your kids, or in your parents that can ever do anything for you. John 1:12 says, as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become the children of God, even to those who believed on his name. The choice is personal. And every day we need to be making that choice. Number 3, he says, whom you will serve. And here's the point. Never miss this. Don't forget this. We lose sight of this very often. Whatever we choose to worship, we choose to serve. If we choose to worship the gods of our parents or our past or our present, that is what we are going to serve. Romans 6:16 says, don't you know that whoever you yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants you are to whom you obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. It is not possible to choose to worship something without becoming a servant and a slave of that. And all of us can identify with that. We've all had times in our lives when we have put too much emphasis and too much hope in something apart from Christ, and we know that that thing enslaves us. It takes a hold of us, and sometimes it's all we can think about it. It's all we can dedicate our lives to. Whatever we choose to worship, we choose to serve. And so Joshua says, listen, in essence what he's saying, this isn't 1, 2, 3, 4, choose your favorite 2. Just choose one thing. Because whatever you choose to worship, you become a servant of that one thing. So someone asked the question, all right, I get it. I've got a timeline, something like that. Maybe not the same story, but I see the faithfulness of God in my life. As you present this challenge to me, I know that God is good and God is faithful and He's the only God who's not a counterfeit God. And so, yeah, Rusty, I get it, and I choose that God. But where do we go from here? Well, thankfully, Joshua gives us the answer. God gives us the answer through Joshua. The first one, he's already told us. Joshua has brought these people through a timeline, and the first thing he has emphasized is the importance of remembering. Remember the faithfulness. Remember the goodness of God. You see, Joshua knew the importance of going through this, of reminding these people that for all of these years, God never was untrue to His word. He never didn't deliver. He knows the importance of people being reminded of that. And God is, you've heard me say, God is a God who is a landmark God. He loves it when we put up landmarks. Write it in your journal, build an altar, build a monument, remind your kids, tell your kids, have them pass it down to their kids, because God knows the importance of remembering. Because Joshua knows and because God knows there's going to come a time when that same fire that's flowing through your veins right now, that God, I'm just so fired up about you, is not going to be there. Somebody's going to come through your path, and a temptation is going to come, or a challenge is going to come, or life isn't going to be going your way as you hope, and you're going to look at it and you think that God's not delivering, and you're going to be so tempted to say, you know what? Maybe I'll choose something else. And so Joshua's point is to just remember. Remember that nothing else has been faithful. No one else is real. No one else has ever demonstrated that they can do what God says He can do. I remember a number of years ago, and I won't relay the story to you, but I remember God did something in our family that I think still goes down in the journals as the most incredible thing that I've ever seen God do in my family to demonstrate the limitlessness of His power. And I still remember that night, putting my head on the pillow and saying, God, I will never question you again. I will never doubt your power and your ability to do anything again. And for about 3 or 4 weeks, I was just on this spiritual cloud and just trusting God for everything. But as is inevitable, what always happens, as the days went on, I began to forget about that. And before you know it, I was questioning God and doubting His ability to do things much smaller than the thing that He had done just weeks before. Why? Because I didn't remember. Because it didn't stay fresh on my mind. We need to remember, and that's why God calls us to do that. Sadly, in this story, we're in the end of Joshua. The next book in the chronological timeline of human history is Judges. And just Judges chapter 2, 2 chapters in, we read that Joshua has died, and a new leader has risen up, and the people have forgotten the ways of God. By the time we get to Judges 21, 25, we read, everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. Why? Because they forgot the faithfulness of God. We need to remember, number one. Number two, we need to reject. I want you to understand something. We cannot bring anything with us into our relationship with Christ. God will stand for no competitors. There is no such thing as God and this in terms of our worship, in terms of what we will serve. It is God and God alone. We cannot bring anything in with us. The people of God got this. Joshua got this. In fact, in 3 different occasions, they made reference to that. In verse 14, they said, or Joshua said, put away the gods that your fathers served. He understood that in order to worship God, there was a need to reject, to renounce, to put away something else. Because you can't have both. In fact, the people said in verse 16, they said, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord in order to serve other gods. They got it. If I'm going to serve God, I have to forsake. If I'm going to serve other gods, I have to forsake the Lord to do that. And it goes the other way. If I'm going to serve God, I need to forsake other gods to do that. And then lastly, in verse 20, Joshua again repeats that, if you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, you simply cannot have both. This is as absurd as you and I coming home from work or from whatever we're doing in any given day and coming to our spouse and making a statement like this. You know what, honey? I'm crazy about this relationship. I'm really glad I'm part of it. But, I'm just not sure that everything I was hoping for is going to be part of this relationship. So is it okay if I date around? I just kind of like to play the field a little bit and just have a few relationships. And of course, you'll be my main one. You'll be my primary one. But just love to have them all. I hope that your spouse would shut that down pretty quick and say, you're crazy, and we're going to see a counselor. Because that's not going to happen. But we do that with God. We do that with God. God, I love to have you. I love what you deliver. I love what you can do. But I kind of want this too. And God will tolerate no rivals. I don't care how big they are or how small they are. It can be a very small thing. But if we worship it, we begin to serve it. And God will tolerate no rivals. Paul said of the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians, he says, the word about you has gone through all the world, how you have turned from idols to serve the living God. It's just part of the process. We turn from idols to serve the living God. One more quote from God's at War. Kyle Edwin says this. This is the challenge for many of us. The problem isn't that we need to choose to follow Jesus. The problem is that we've tried to follow him without leaving something behind. It means we need to reject. There are things that are part of our parents, part of our past, part of our present, part of our culture that we are holding on to. Every one of us in this room. Our worship of God will never be what it is supposed to be until we say, like the psalmist in Psalm 139, God, search my heart. Try my heart, know my ways, see if there be any wicked way in me. Lord, what am I worshiping that is not you? We need to reject that. And then the last one, nobody likes this one. Nobody likes number 3, regulate. And it's an R, it's kind of a bad word, regulate. But you know what the Bible says here in Joshua chapter 24? Joshua says, okay guys, you've made this choice. You've made a decision to follow Christ. In verse number 24, the Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and put in place statutes and rules for them at Shechem. Nobody likes rules. We live in a culture like never before that just hates boundaries and rules, and nothing it's not okay to say that this is right and this is wrong and to put boundaries. God is a God of boundaries. We don't know exactly what Joshua did, what those rules look like. Probably he went back to the law of Moses and relayed to them the rules that God had given them in Exodus and Leviticus. Probably what he did. He may have also said to these people, listen guys, I want to challenge you this. You've got some struggles. You know what your struggles are. I would suggest to you that to walk in wisdom is to begin to make some boundaries for your life. To say, you know what, here's my struggle. Here's the path that I'm going to go down. In fact, the psalmist says in Psalm 101, he says, I will ponder a path that is blameless. Picture that I get of the psalmist is, God, I woke up this morning and I want to walk a path today that is blameless, that is righteous before you. But yesterday I did this and I went to this place and I know that by going there I put myself in a place of great temptation. And you know what, God, I blew it. And so today I'm wandering a whole different path and I'm not going to go down that road. I'm not going to hang around with that crowd or go to that place or watch that on television because those are the places that I find myself becoming fickle and blowing it. And I'm going to ponder a path that's blameless. Those are boundaries. Those are rules, and every one of us needs to make them for ourselves, as well as submit to the ones that God has for him. say one of the most convicting things what one of my kids has ever done in my life is we were in the car one day, and Jen and I had decided we were going to do a family activity. And I was so excited about it, and I said to the kids, I looked in the rearview mirror waiting for the face, I said, kids, we're going to do this. In December, we're going to do this. And the two of the kids were just, yeah, all right, and just cheering and yelling. And one of them just kind of sat there with hardly a smile on their face. And so as we started, I didn't make any comment, but stopped later, and I took that child aside, and I said, what's going on? Did it excite you at all? And this child looked at me and said, Dad, I already felt like that one thing in my life could become an idol. It's something that I already think that I could very easily worship and use to take the place of God. And I don't think that it would be good for me to do that. And I looked on with such conviction in my heart because I confessed to you this morning that that had already become an idol in my life. And I hadn't been willing to take the same measures, to take the same steps. They made a rule. I just want God. All I want is God. And if something's going to come in the way of that, I just can't have it. You and I need to do that. If all we want is God, then really nothing's a sacrifice. If all we want is Him, I have a friend who's got cancer and all kinds of other problems in his body, and so he's changed his whole diet. In fact, it just doesn't even seem edible, and I wonder what's worse, eating that or going to heaven early. I just don't get it. But if you were to say to him, is that a sacrifice? He would say, a sacrifice. I'm healthy now. It's from a physical standpoint, he would say, I want good health. And this has given me good health. I beat cancer, and I beat this, and I beat this by God's power. So no, it's not a sacrifice at all. Well, what the trade-off would be crazy. And it's the same thing with us. If all we want is God, if all I want is a relationship and intimacy with Christ, and God says, here's the deal. I'd rather you not do this, and you can't do this, and I want you to do this, and I want you to submit to this. If all we want is God, then nothing is a sacrifice. Because we look at that and say, well, I gave up that because now I have intimacy with Christ. No sacrifice at all. And so we need to regulate our lives. Over and over again in the book of Judges and Chronicles, we see this phrase that the people of God refused to tear down the high places. The high places were the places that the people that were not God's people would go and they would worship all of these people, the Ites and the Amorites. They would go up to these altars and they would do these sacrifices to their counterfeit gods. Well, God would tell the people of God, I want you to go in here and you're going to fight a battle and you're going to destroy them, and I want you're just going to wipe out everything, and I want you to tear down the high places. Now here's the deal. The people of God, these were the places that the Amorites and so on would worship these false gods. So why was it so important? Well, God knew that what would happen is if they kept those high places in place, that they would become a stumbling block. They would become a temptation. And sure enough, we see over and over again God's people going to those high places and worshiping the gods of their culture. Nothing wrong with a pile of stones. But for those people, there was something wrong with it because of what? The temptation that it put in their lives. And every one of us has high places. Every one of us. And what God determined to be a good king or a bad king, you look at the end of every king's life and God said, he was a good king, but he did not tear down the high places. He was a really good king because he tore down the high places. You and I look at our lives, God, what are the high places in my life? What are the places where I find myself going to the altar and worshiping something other than you? Dag, I don't know how to pronounce this, Dag Hammarskjöld, former Secretary General to the United States in the 50s, said you cannot play with the animal within without becoming a holy animal. Play with the falsehood without forfeiting your right to truth. Play with cruelty without losing your sensitivity of mind. He who wants to keep his garden tidy doesn't reserve a plot for weeds. Whoever wants to keep his garden tidy doesn't reserve a plot for weeds. And the fact is, we can't play with it, we can't tolerate it, we can't downplay it, we can't call it something that it's not, we can't allow it without being changed by it. And these counterfeit gods that exist in our lives, we need to begin to call them what they are and stop tolerating them and stop playing with them and downplaying them and allowing them to change us and just say, God, help me remove them by your grace, by your power. If it keeps us from intimacy with Jesus, it simply has to go. I pray this morning that your heart's desire is nothing more than I want to know God. I want to know Jesus Christ. Paul said, I want nothing more than to know Christ and the power of his resurrection, to be made like him, to be conformed to him, even unto his death. I pray that that is your heart's desire, to know him, to be in intimacy with him, to experience from John 10:10 the abundant life that Jesus Christ came to offer. Well, I'll tell you, for the authority of God's word from Joshua 24, we've got a choice to make. The gods of our parents, the gods of our past, the gods of our present, or the one true God. And if this morning you choose the God of the Bible, the God of the universe, the God who made you, the God who loves you, the God who wants and is able to do what is best for you, my challenge to you would be to remember. Go home, write it down. Write it, remind yourself of the faithfulness of God. Talk to your kids about it. Call somebody up and say, you know what, I just was thinking about this and I just want to tell you what God did. Remember. But allow God to point out to you those parts, those gods, those counterfeit gods that you need to reject. And then submit to the statutes and regulations that none of us like, but they are boundaries that bring us life. Boundaries that bring us life. Here's a corny way to close this, but I was thinking about my turtle last night. I had a turtle for 8 years. I caught him when he was a little bit smaller than a quarter. And I don't know why, Joshua 24 just reminded me of this. For 8 years I had this thing. I watched him grow from this tiny little thing to this good-sized little turtle. I had this incredibly beautiful fountain, made it out of cement and rocks, and it had a waterfall, and it was in my bedroom. It was a paradise for any turtle. And I had to put up this plexiglass thing.